Welcome to the Happy Doc, the voice of fulfilled physicians. This show is about bringing inspirational, creative, successful, and happy health professionals to you. Get ready to learn how you can be a happy doctor too.
Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to part 2 of our Happy Doc KevinMD podcast with Taylor. This is Neil again, and I am actually the oldest member of the team on the Happy Doc team, and I'm actually probably old enough to be these kids' dads, so they're going to have to explain to me what's up with taking pictures of food all the time, as well as what's a bay and what's fleek. I still haven't figured that out. So while I try to go figure that out, I'm going to go yell at some scary-looking teens on my lawn. And meanwhile, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of the Happy Doc with Kevin Poe and Taylor. So take it away, guys.
So given the fact, again, you're a social media expert, I'm sure there are plenty tools that you use beyond, just Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn. I know I saw you mention in one of your videos, you mentioned Hootsuite. Are there any other maybe lesser known tools that you utilize to help you stay organized?
I think my biggest tool right now is simply just Gmail and keeping everything organized there. So I think Gmail is really my hub in terms of not only organizing all the posts that come in and out, but in terms of notifying authors that their posts are going up the next day. And there's a plugin for Gmail called Write Inbox that I use that actually schedules posts. And I think that's tremendously powerful. So that's something kind of a lesser known tool that I use. You can schedule posts. I use that as a reminder system as well because I check Gmail so frequently. And so I think I don't know what I do without that. You mentioned Hootsuite, which is a great central hub for all my social media platforms, and I use that as kind of a control board where I can monitor what people are talking on Twitter about me, about other topics, about social media. I use it to also follow my sports teams as well, to follow what people are saying about the New England Patriots. So I think Hootsuite is great. Let me see what other, I'm just looking at my list of tools here. I think there's a tool called Grammarly, which is an online grammar checker that I normally use to edit all the posts and edit the posts that I write as well. And I think that's pretty essential. So I think that it depends on what areas that you're specifically looking for, but I can certainly recommend tools for pretty much any area of social media that I use. Probably beyond the scope of this podcast. I don't want to go through too many tools, but sure. Those are just some of the few that I use relatively frequently.
I mean, that question is probably more so out of my own selfish curiosity, but no, that's great. So you did mention, of course, that you're editing a great deal of, I'll just say, I'm just so impressed that you are able to go through all of these articles and help, edit and get these posts on board. How do you one, stay so efficient, and two, where's the time? I'm just so impressed.
Sure. So as it's obviously a commitment. I do a lot of my editing and curating before I go to work. I don't work full time, and that's a decision I made earlier in the year to go from full time to part time, so I can have more time not only with my family but also managing KevinMD. So I do a lot of the curating, editing before I go to work. My clinic starts at 8:00, so I start at like 5:30 every morning, and then I also do editing and curating and writing and practicing my speeches. I do that also after my kids sleep around 9 or 10 for a few hours as well. So it's every day. It's at least 3 to 6 hours in addition to a normal clinic day, and it is a lot, but it's something that I do enjoy doing. And paradoxically, even though it's a lot of hours, as I mentioned earlier, it does give you energy because it's something that I'm passionate about. And if you're passionate about something, of course, it's not quite work. So I think that there have been ups and downs, but on the whole, it's been more rewarding than it has been tiring, and that's why I continue doing it.
That's amazing. Now, as you were saying this, a question that came to mind is, you mentioned that this was a passion of yours to collect these stories, to help these stories be promoted, and obviously promote yourself in turn. Did you stumble? I'm just curious. Did you stumble into creating KevinMD, or was this some form of almost intentional thing that you constructed even before it actually happened?
It definitely wasn't intentional. When I started it back in 2004, I certainly didn't have it being a goal where it's a platform where I can represent thousands of healthcare voices and be what it is today. I think when it comes to medicine, you look at other industries and other areas and see what they're doing with social media, because pretty much every other field and industry are at least 3 to 5 years ahead of medicine. So if you follow other fields and go with their trends, you'll always be ahead of the game in medicine, right? So I looked in other fields like journalism and saw where things were going with the more legacy type platforms like paper newspapers. And I noticed that a lot of online sites would essentially be an amalgamation of voices and articles. It's not necessarily one person writing that article. So I took that model from online news sites, and I applied it to KevinMD and transferred my site. Not only I transferred my site from only my voice to a collection of voices, and that took the stress off me because I didn't have to produce all that content. But I knew that once I built a platform and once people could see the benefit of publishing on KevinMD, I knew that then people would want to contribute to the site. You take an obvious example would be the Huffington Post, for instance. The Huffington Post built a platform where it gets millions of page views, and authors would contribute to that site in exchange for the exposure that they'll get and the potential connections that they'll make by contributing to that site. So I wanted to apply that Huffington Post model to the medical world, and so far it's been pretty successful.
Well, it definitely has. And, when I see an article that's posted from KevinMD, I definitely feel like it has that reputation. When it gets posted on Facebook and I'm like, oh, that's a KevinMD article, that's how I'll tell you, that's how it's referred, within the medical circles, at least, around the people I'm around. So you definitely have that reputation. It's very commendable. Now, you curate a lot of stories along this path. What are some of the things you've learned just from not necessarily like technical, but you must have learned a tremendous amount just by reading all of these stories. What are some takeaways you've gained along this journey?
I think one of the biggest takeaway is that physicians don't quite appreciate the patient experience through the healthcare system. And I think whenever a story gets posted and you read the comments, and some of those comments are from patients, and they provide a perspective that as a physician I had no idea about. A lot of times physicians, they're not aware of the challenges patients face just simply navigating through the morass of paperwork or dealing with specialists, and just navigating the healthcare system has been such a chore for patients. And I don't think that I really appreciated what they went through until I read some of the feedback to some of the articles on my site. So that's really the biggest takeaway. And the biggest thing that I've learned is this really garnering the perspective of patients from some of the articles on my site. Of course, we could talk about things like healthcare reform, and that's very, very polarizing. Obviously, everyone has opinion in terms of which direction our health system should go. So whenever there's a conservative or progressive approach to healthcare reform, it's very instructive to go into the comments and read both sides of the argument. It's very instructive to go on Twitter and start conversing with my readers when we're talking about things like single payer, when we're talking about things like affirmative action in medical school. It's very instructive to get all sides of that debate, and it's really helped clarify my thinking when it comes to all of these issues.
That's amazing. And something I do appreciate about what you do is you don't necessarily pick and choose what content you're going to put up. You obviously are selective, I'm sure, but you, as you've mentioned in previous podcast episodes and in interviews, you don't select, if you were more liberal, you wouldn't select only liberal articles, for instance, or if you were conservative, you wouldn't just choose conservative articles. You really do provide a wide spectrum of opinions. And a lot of the work on there isn't just necessarily academic writing. It's often, there's poetry on there, there's personal stories. I just recently had Christina Dacus on, and she shared on your website a personal story about her father. So there's a wide array of articles on there. But to switch gears, I wanted to ask you, there's a lot of talk about burnout and depression and all of these topics. What are some of the things you do when you feel exhausted? How do you recharge? How do you center yourself?
I think the biggest thing that I have is that you got to have a passion outside of clinical medicine. And, I mentioned obviously what I do with KevinMD. It gives me energy, even though it is a lot of physical work, but it does re-energize me when it comes to seeing patients again. I don't think that it's realistic for physicians to have that their single passion to be clinical medicine, because right now clinical medicine is obscured by so many obstacles, and that's where I think the burnout happens, is when you have these doctors whose single focus is clinical medicine. They're the ones who are getting burnt out because they want so badly to do well by the patient, but there are so many things against them. And I think that if they don't have a passion that parallels that, that's where they run into trouble and become statistics. So I think it's tremendously important to have a passion outside of clinical medicine. For me, it's KevinMD. For me, it's my family. For others, it could be a hobby. It could be their family. It could be their kids. But medicine cannot be their single focus in life, because I think the physicians who have medicine as their single focus in life are the ones who tend to get burnt out. So in order for me to center myself, I think I do need that passion outside of clinical medicine, whether it's, going out and practicing keynotes, practicing presentations, or spending time with my kids and spending time away from clinical medicine. And when I come back, I do feel re-energized when I see patients again.
That's wonderful. And I think, a lot of it has to do with the fact that any, frustration or, upset feelings that you might have, you can channel that into something else. You can use that as maybe fuel for KevinMD. Obviously, you're not going to channel your anger into your family, hopefully, but you can.
Sure.
But you have some way to channel that, and I think that's a great point. Is those individuals who might not have an alternative passion. When they do get frustrated, medicine is so personal to them that then there's no secondary or tertiary concept or idea to fuel into. So I think that's a very wise statement you said. Another question I had for you is, obviously, I think anyone listening to you is going to think you're a great inspiration. And not only that, but you allow other inspirations and influencers to come out of your site. But who inspires you?
Well, whenever I think about my inspirations, I actually look outside of medicine. And to me, other people who are great influencers certainly inspire me. So people who've built social media platforms themselves and made their voices heard. So we're talking about people like Guy Kawasaki, like Michael Hyatt, like Darren Rouse. Those inspire me because they've built their own platforms from social media tools and they've become tremendous influencers. I'm a big fan of the craft of public speaking, and I think in order to have influence, you do need to be a good speaker. So you need to be able to articulate and share your ideas. So I think anyone who's able to share their ideas outside of a one-to-one setting and put themselves into a one-to-many setting, I think it's tremendously powerful. So I look at speakers like Michael Port, like Gar Reynolds. Those are wonderful speakers that have also inspired me. I talked at the very beginning about how speaking spontaneously is a little bit of a challenge to me. I wish that would be my superpower. And I think something related to that is Susan Cain's work. As you know, she wrote The Power of Introverts, that very popular TED Talk and book. And I think I do have a classic introverted personality. And I was always trying to fit in, as she puts it, in a world of extroverts. So after seeing her TED Talk and reading her book, and it made me more comfortable with who I am. And rather than trying to shore up my weaknesses, I've doubled down on my strengths and more comfortable with who I am, and I'm still able to be successful, being who I am, and even though I'm a classically introverted personality. So those are just a few of my inspirations that have made me who I am.
That's wonderful. And what I love about that question is obviously you are an influencer. I mean, no one will argue that at this point, but it's interesting to find out who influences the influencer, because then you can start to maybe pick a little bit apart of who Kevin Poe is and get to know what parts make you such a fantastic individual. And it's great to understand that from you. Given those influencers, and maybe there's other content as well, can you think of maybe a recent piece of content or a book that you might have read recently that really impacted you?
I'm looking at all the stories that people write on KevinMD when it comes to burnout. I think when you mentioned about how I represent both sides of various issues, I do that. But when it comes to burnout, I'm universally on the physician side. And I try to promote as many of those stories as I can. Some of those stories are heartbreaking. You have physicians who spent their whole life dedicated to becoming doctors, and when they graduate, it isn't what they've thought that it would be. And all those stories have affected me tremendously. And and then you read stories that Pamela Weibel puts up about, physician suicides, and it's just completely tragic what's happening to the medical profession. So a lot of the stories when it comes to burnout, suicide, I think they've been tremendously influential, and it's made me certainly more partial to highlighting the plight of many doctors and medical students, for that matter, who are fighting burnout as they go through their medical journey.
Wow. That's so true. And a follow-up question to that is, since you are exposed to many of these burnout articles, beyond just, what you had described with, finding an alternative passion besides medicine, have you found any other maybe techniques or ways that people can really reconnect back to their roots and get away from, these, suicidal thinking, depressed thoughts? Anything that you may have picked up?
I think one of the things that I alluded to this earlier in the interview, was that I went from full-time to part-time. And I think that when you're talking as a primary care doctor, it's really impossible for primary care doctors to do what they have to do and still be full-time and see 20 to 30 patients a day, 5 days a week. And I don't think that's realistic at all. I think that even if I didn't have KevinMD, I don't think I can practice full-time medicine. And I think that physicians need to kind of reflect and think about how much can they do. I think a lot of doctors who are working at maximum capacity and getting burnt out, are they really the best doctor they could be for their patients? And I'd argue in some cases that's not the case. So I think that a lot of physicians should think about, not to say that they should go part-time, but I think sacrifice income for time, because I think time is tremendously valuable for them to stay physicians, but also be better doctors for the patients as well. So I think that's the biggest piece of advice that I'd ask physicians to reflect on.
That's really beautiful, and actually it reminds me of I believe there was an article discussing kind of the top regrets that people are saying on their deathbed, for example, and one of the points was time, and that people will justify so much of the work they do for saying it's for the money or it's for this or for that. But you just said it yourself, like, time is such an important asset that we have, and I don't always think that my cohort of classmates realize how much time we use and how precious it is. So I really love that, you brought up that point. And for all the listeners out there, definitely think about that. Do you respect your time? And are there ways maybe you can open up space so you can enjoy a passion of yours, especially if you're feeling down? That was a really well stated point. With that being said, Dr. Kevin Poe, I think that was a fantastic conversation. I like to leave kind of the ending here to you and ask you, is there any takeaway or tip that you'd like to leave to the listeners today?
I think whenever physicians talk about, I'm always going to go back to social media. Whenever they hear about social media, it's always from a negative perspective. They always hear it from their lawyer or from their school. Don't do this. Don't, these headlines about doctors getting fired because they post inappropriate content online. The point is that most of us in healthcare, they hear about social media from a negative perspective. And what I do when I try to share my story in podcasts like these or in presentations, I always share about how social media not only has affected my life in a positive way, but of thousands of other physicians as well. And I try to share their more positive stories and how they can make a difference in healthcare social media. So my reminder to clinicians and medical students and residents is that whenever you hear about those warnings about social media, just remember that the power of social media certainly dwarfs that.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. And something that I want to tell to the listeners today is, Dr. KevinMD, like Dr. Kevin Poe's website, KevinMD.com, is just such a great way to express yourself. And if you're a writer, but you're a little bit shy, you can always post anonymous. But your voice is not only special and important, it's necessary to share. Because that one article you share that's really impactful and powerful could potentially save someone's life, could definitely touch someone's life. And KevinMD.com, that website allows you to have your voice heard. So again, thank you so much for what you've done, what you've created. I've personally used the platform, and I felt so invigorated by using it. And I definitely want all the people listening to give it a try and write something, express yourself. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Kevin Poe.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Well, take care. Hey guys, we hope you enjoyed this episode, and we want you to definitely subscribe to our social media channels. Check out The Happy Doc on Facebook, iTunes, Twitter, and Instagram. Please like, subscribe, share, and send us feedback. And please check out the website, www.thehappydoc.com. Again, we hope you enjoyed The Happy Doc, the voice of fulfilled physicians. Peace out.